Dan Barker. He's Chief Architect with RSA Archer. And Dan's been working with DevOps and security topics for about 6 years. And his talk is going to be on understanding how risks can fund transformation. Dan, you ready?
Yes.
All right, Dan.
All right, we're about 5 minutes behind, but we will end on time, so don't worry. So who here gets, actually let's start by thanking the organizers and the sponsors that you just heard from and give them a big round of applause. These are a lot of work. I'm an organizer for the DevOpsDays in Kansas City, and these are a lot of work. So if you see an organizer or a sponsor, thank them for their participation today. Who here, when they hear the word risk, gets really excited? A few people, yes, okay. That's about normal. So if risk doesn't just naturally excite you, then hopefully this talk will show you the value of understanding risk within your enterprise. So I currently work for RSA Archer, which has a big play in the risk space through risk management. But I came here because of my previous experiences with risk. So at a previous employer, we were trying to fund a transformation and going through different avenues, which we'll discuss, and we couldn't get it funded until we discovered risk. And then after that employer, I went to the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, and insurance is pretty much all about risk. So as I learned more and more about risk, I discovered its real importance, and that is oftentimes can put a company out of business if they don't understand their risk well enough. So I'm going to start with a quote from Ellen DeGeneres that I thought was pretty good. When you take risks, you learn that there will be times when you succeed and there will be times when you fail, and both are equally important. So the understanding risk is important because you need to understand which risks are dangerous, which risks you need to avoid, and which risks are worth taking. So failing at a risk that is good is not a bad thing in corporate worlds. That is a solid risk to take. It didn't cost too much money, and we'll discuss a little bit about that. And it's also really valuable to go through the practice of identifying risks. So if you want to understand your system better, understanding the risks that could affect your system is a very good practice. And a lot of you do that already without labeling it risk. But putting a quantification on risk is valuable for the business and can often help you fund some of your initiatives that you're trying to get funded. So we were struggling to get a transformation funded, and we went through a lot of work to quantify the different avenues by which we could get this funded. We had a horrible patching process. Not only was our software, our applications not automatically patched, and we didn't have good data on them, but we also didn't have good patching methods for our operating systems. So all of those you would often find had been up for many years and they had never been patched really, and that's a fairly bad practice and pretty risky. So we needed to solve that problem, and we were trying to solve it with more of the CI/CD approach and that continuous patching and updating. Our leadership looked at it as a one-time thing, something that we can run through and patch all of this over the course of about 2 years to patch all of our systems and applications, and then we would be fine. And I think all of us here know that that's not reality, that as soon as you patch, you could have another critical vulnerability in production that needs to be patched immediately. So we needed to have a better system. So there are many ways to sell transformations, or any project really. One of those is increasing revenue. So this is what we went to first. We tried to say that getting a CI/CD system would allow business to deliver value to customers faster. This is really hard to quantify. And even though we had several products who were on board with this and working with us to better understand how they would increase revenue, we couldn't get the revenue increase to be evident enough, and our CEO did not buy that that revenue is going to actually occur. And that's really common, that when you base your analyses on increasing revenue, a lot of times they don't come to fruition. Sometimes you get more than you expected, but a lot of times they don't have the return on value that you would expect. We also tried to increase our savings or decrease headcount. And when you're doing a big project like this, or a big initiative, or a DevOps transformation, you are going to have a bubble. So you're going to have to hire a bunch of people to fix things or to patch things. Those could be consultants or contractors that you are more sure are going to phase out over time. But they also could be full-time hires. And then you have to figure out what to do once you have those people hired. We then moved to decreasing risk. So I met our new chief risk officer. Risk was a new thing for our company generally. And he showed me that we could sell this transformation through the decreased risk that we would have as a company. And he also talked to me about the risk budget that our CEO had, which I'll get to in a minute. So when we first tried to quantify our revenue increase, we discovered that we were really looking more at Washingtons than Benjamins. So we were not going to make the revenue increases that we had needed to fund this transformation. And this transformation was expected to cost about $100 million. We then looked at trying to decrease the headcount and how this automation would allow us to decrease our overall headcount. We very quickly got into the state of saying, well, we don't want to fire good people, which often happens. And so we said, well, if we have more good people, then isn't this really an increased revenue analysis? And we were trying to figure out, what these new people might be able to do for our system and increasing our revenue. So we still weren't able to, even with fewer people and potentially better people providing more value, we weren't able to quantify that in a way that our CEO was okay with this project moving forward. So then we moved to a risk-based analysis. And we were really focused on a question of how do you sell a project that's mostly about fixing all the things that have made you successful so far, but are now holding you back. Because that's largely what had happened. We were obviously very successful. We were making billions a year. We had huge stakes in the markets we were in. So all of those decisions that had been made before weren't necessarily bad decisions, but they were decisions that made us successful, and now we weren't able to move as fast as we needed, and we weren't able to protect ourselves. So we had a broken system, and we had to fix it. So this is a simple way for quantifying risk that anyone can do. We were all very naive in how to quantify risk. And all of this is somewhat contextual, but working with your risk or security office and working with your leadership will allow you to understand the constraints within your own system, to know how to address the issues that the leadership, whether that's the board or the CEO, will have with your proposals. So we're going to walk through some of the data, the general data about data breaches and the risk. So the average data breach is $7.3 million. And this was a study done by IBM, and that is the base average for everybody in the US. Third parties, any kind of third party raises that average to even a higher amount. There were 668 breaches in 2018. I actually found numbers that were higher than this, but all were about here or double this, so in that range. There were 1,369,452,404 records stolen in 2018. So that's a lot of data. If you haven't been on the site, have I been owned, owned spelled with a P, go on there and you will probably find your data has been stolen multiple times. But you should definitely get on there because one of those is probably yours. This stat comes from Derek Weeks' company, Sonotype, where they did the state of the software supply chain. I think he may be talking more about this later. There's a 71% increase from 2014 in open source software related breaches. And there is 57% of your applications, of your proprietary applications, are open source. And that comes from helpnetsecurity.com. And the Equifax breach is now over $700 million cost to them. And that could increase in the future. So that's a massive breach. And that could have been a company-ending breach if they didn't have a relationship with the government. They very well could have been out of business. So looking at all of this data, we determined that our base risk was $14.4 billion, which is a lot. But we had a lot of particular data, and this isn't the whole story. And that was mostly based on the IBM data. So we had hundreds of millions of records. These records were financial and health data. So those are the highest costs. So when you add financial data and health data, along with having third parties, your average goes from 7.3 to about double that. So we also had limited patching capabilities, which is another factor that increases our average amount of cost for each breach. We had hundreds of different applications. So we actually had over 400 applications, and these aren't like microservices. This is a 50-year-old company. So we had 400 fairly complex applications. And a lot of those had access to the same data or to different sets of the same data. Our CEO had a risk budget of $50 million. This is really important to know. So if you have a CEO or someone who's heading up your company, find out what their risk budget is. That's the first thing you need to do to see if you can even achieve that amount. So this means that our CEO was willing to risk $50 million on anything. So if our analysis showed that we were only going to be at $25 million worth of risk, then that was acceptable risk. So if a breach occurred, $25 million was fine. So our $14.4 billion did not seem reasonable. That was actually more than we made in a year. So we were about a $4.5 billion company. And that was about what we were bringing in. We did have some protections. So when we did that first analysis, that was based on if every single one of our records was exposed with like an open door, like we just left everything open, then they would just take everything and nothing would trigger. That was 14.4. We did have WAFs, we had security teams, we had a SOC. So we had a lot of other protections that we needed to factor in that we weren't factoring in with the $14.4 billion. So we focused on fixing patching and what that would do to our overall risk. We looked at our riskiest apps. So rather than saying that, looking at all 400 and saying that all 400 are going to get breached at the same time, and this is our risk, we looked at the riskiest apps. And then we looked at some more information about those around what vulnerabilities were there and what kind of data was underneath, how much data we thought could be exfiltrated before we would have triggers go off saying that there was data potentially being exfiltrated by a malicious source. And we used that to calculate the risk. So this was our very basic and simple equation. So we had how many likely records would be breached before we stopped the breach, before we could put the brakes on it. We had the number of vulnerabilities in the application. That was really an average over our riskiest applications. and our average cost per record, which came straight from IBM's analysis, which was $144 per record. And we looked at the average likelihood. I'm not going to cover the average likelihood analysis. That a lot of that came from the chief risk officer, but you can determine that through some analysis of the industry and your data, the kind of data you have, how targeted is it. We were notified by the government that we were targeted by nation states because we held so much financial data that if we were breached, the economy could collapse. So we had a very high risk of being breached. So this number will probably be a little bit higher for the 1%, but we thought that was probably reasonable for us, is that we were about a 1% risk of getting breached. Some people thought it was higher because of the nation-state attack risk, that they would likely be successful. But we also decided that we would probably be exposed, about 50 million records would be exposed if any one of those applications were breached. There were about 7 vulnerabilities that would be at risk of exposing our data. And then the 144 is from the IBM study. And we had a 1% likelihood that we would get breached. So this ended up being about $500 million. And the investment to fix all of the issues that we had was $100 million. So we were trying to look at the risk budget of our CEO and understand, were we going to be above the risk budget? So if we take the $500 million subtract it from the $100 million, then this gives us $400 million. This number needs to be above the $50 million. So if we had $125 million as our total risk, and it would cost us $100 million to fix, it's probably not worth fixing for the CEO. Obviously, we all think it's worth fixing. But for the business, it's probably worth taking that $25 million difference and just taking the loss on it. So there's actually a better way to do this, and that is factor analysis of information risk. So this is an open standard. It is been adopted by the Open Group as Open Fair, and this is something that the FAIR Institute has been stood up on to kind of propagate this information. There's some good websites with a lot of information about this. We didn't use this. We didn't know about it at the time. We did a very naive approach. This should give you a lot more information about your system and the real risk that you might have. It is free to use within your own company, but you need to license it if you want to consult with another company or engage with them in any way. RiskLens and RSA Archer have partnered to be able to offer this as a service to RSA Archer customers. So if you want to use it, you can go through that method, but there's no reason that you have to use this framework. So we took all of this data from our simple methodology, and we took it to our CEO, and we included the $14.4 billion because it was a big, FUD factor, I guess. But we took that information and we provided it to our CEO and said, basically, we believe that we're about a $500 million risk if we get breached. And our CEO agreed with that. And during the transformation, the Equifax breach occurred, which really validated our assessment. And in fact, when we looked at it, we said we were probably we're undervaluing our breach by about $500 million, since they could they had less harmful data than we did. And so if we got breached, we would probably cost even more than them, and they were already over $700 million. So we thought we were probably undervalued our estimate. Potentially with this, we would have gotten a better valuation and a better estimate of our risk. But we didn't have this tool available. So we ended up doing the transformation and solving a lot of these problems. During this analysis, we were going through some of the tactical motions of manually patching things, so don't not do those. But you really need that automated system. And if you can't sell it through having a increased revenue analysis that benefits you, or decreasing the cost of the business, then look to risk. Risk is definitely becoming a more important part of every business and making these business decisions. So the more you know about your application and its risks, the more you will actually understand about your overall system. And I'm done. Thank you. Excited about risk. Okay, you are all evangelists now, if you weren't already. Feel free to come up and chat with me. I will be around. Lunch is happening in just a minute. And I'm happy to chat about non-RSA Archer things. Feel free to email me or reach out on Twitter. Thank you.